Okay, so just going to give this a try. Hopefully everything's working okay. Going to try and do some live streaming as I work on a UI component for Stellar Trail. This is the first time I've ever tried doing a dev time live on stream, so I'm not exactly sure how it's going to work. Any suggestions would be welcome, but let's just give it a shot. I'll be checking the chat periodically. I won't be paying complete attention to it, so if you have a question or comment, go ahead and put it in the chat, and I'll respond briefly when I check them. So what am I doing? So right now I'm working on the component browser, and the purpose of this component browser is to well, allows you to browse components. So hardware components are things like engines, fuel tanks. Well, at the moment that's the only things there are, but basically larger components like engines, fuel tanks, boosters, command pods, rovers, satellite cores, all those would be components, hardware components. And when building a rocket, or even if you just want to look at things, you have to have a way of browsing through those components. So last couple of days I've been working on defining those components, figuring out how I want to structure them, and building a serialization system that allows me to read those read that component data at runtime from JSON files, and that includes a dynamic property system. So each individual component isn't predefined; it just has a series of properties assigned to it. The only thing that's predefined is essentially basic information like what it's called, what its description is, and an internal identifier. The rest of the stuff is just done through properties. And so part of the component browser is going to be the need to list the components that you're browsing so you can select them. And the other half down here at the bottom is going to be for listing out those properties that are found in the component. So let's go ahead and get started on that. First of all, I'll show you real quick an example of what a component looks like on disk. So let's go in engines and AJ37. So this here is an example of an engine component and what it looks like on disk. This is the AJ1037. It has an identifier, which is an internal identifier. This should always be unique to every component and allows it to be identified for various scripts. It has a name, a description, and a component type. In this case is an engine. Everything else beyond that is a dynamic property. So ahead of time, the code knows nothing about what this is other than that it is an engine. And that's really for other purposes. But things like mass, diameter, reliability, thrust, and who knows what else that could be added possibly in the future are all done as components. Or sorry, as properties on the component. So you see here we have a property called mass with a value of 84. And we also define what units that is, because otherwise it doesn't know, how to display it to the user or anything like that. So you see kilograms in this case. So that's what a component looks like on disk, and then this is all loaded at runtime through a hardware database. Let's go ahead here, and we'll go into edit this. So this is the hardware database here. Essentially what this is doing, and I'm just going to remove this, don't need this anymore, is building up, it takes all the information from the asset bundle on disk and uses the Unity's JSON utility to load that information dynamically. So the point of this is to now display those components, in this case display the engines in here, and then display the properties of the selected component down here. That's going to look something like this. Let's see here. Grid view list cell. So it'll look something like this. Each one of these components will be listed as a button here, and in the properties it'll look something like this. Oops, sorry, those were already activated. What I wanted is this one, right? So you'll see properties. The name and description will be listed up here. That's already here. It's just they're blank at the moment. So those will be filled in, and then the properties will be listed down there. So something like that. Something like that is what it'll look like. So let's go ahead and get started. To do this, I have written a grid view component, and that grid view component is essentially designed to take a space, whether it be this space here or this space here, whatever, and let's just select this here. This is where the buttons will be. So it takes a space, and based on information such as how big you want the individual items to be, it breaks it into a bunch of cells and displays that. It allows for paging and can be vertical or horizontally laid out. So vertical will fill rows first and then go over to the next column and fill that column and so on, whereas horizontal will fill rows first and then go down row by row afterwards. And it also can be toggled between list mode and icon mode, which I'm not using at the moment, but the idea behind that is that you can user will be able to change this to maybe show little icons for the components. I originally was going that direction, but at the moment decided not to because generating the images for that might be a bit difficult. But see if I have, I don't have an example of those at the moment, but yeah, that's another option. And the grid view is designed to be able to do that. Okay, so now that you've seen that, oh, stupid little bug. Okay, so just gonna hide list cell. Right, so we're going to our code here. We are on the component browser. Just before this video, before I started streaming rather, I did add in the initial parts of this. So this is a bit of a hack at the moment just because it's not integrated into the overall game flow. So I'm just manually starting things up at the moment, but essentially what I'm doing when this component, when this UI initializes, it's keeping an eye out. It's grabbing a reference to the hardware database, which I showed you is right here. This is what will store all the loaded hardware, and is responsible for loading all that data. And then it just checks every frame, waiting for that to actually get some data filled in. And once it's filled in, it will then show the data in the browser, which is where I am here. We're getting our grid view, and then basically for each one of the loaded components, we're creating a cell. We're setting that cell information based on the loaded component's name and identifier. The identifier is going to be used so that when we click on the component, we'll be able to trace back to which component we were clicking on. And then we add that to the grid view, and then we put ourselves register for a callback so we know when it's clicked, which is this right here. Currently doesn't do anything, so I print it out. And that's what this gets us. So let's go ahead and hit play, and we should see the two engines that we've defined are now showing up automatically here. So you know, here's the empty UI, and then at runtime we are populating those engines in here. Obviously, page up and page down aren't going to do anything because there's only one page. But if there was more of these components in reality, you'd be able to page through them. And then if I click on these, you can see down here at the very bottom, you can see the identifier that we've selected it. So that part's working good. The next step is to try and hook up the properties so that when we've selected one of these, it becomes selected in that we see its properties down here. Okay, so let's see what we want to do here. Obviously, we're going to be down here where it's selected. So for the properties, obviously the first thing we can do is, so the properties are down here. Properties, this is our properties object here. The name, description, and then the properties block contains, so the name and description are separate from the properties block. So the name and description will always be the first two items, and the properties block is a smaller area. If I go over here, you can see right here. So properties block doesn't fill in the whole area. This will be where the dynamic properties are displayed. So on the properties block, we have another grid view, and that grid view is set up in such a way that we can add properties to it. Although I notice right now we don't have a template set, so let me do that real quick. Prefabs, and we want our property block as a list template. Let's go ahead and add that, save the scene. That should be good. So just to give you an example of what that might look like, I'm just going to manually add some properties in here and hit play. interestingly enough, we only get one property showing up, which is not what I expected. That's not good. Oh, right. Yeah. Okay. That makes sense just because we haven't really defined anything yet. So that's happening when it sets the cell details. And we don't have any details for the properties yet. But essentially that's what that'll do down there. So let's just set this back to 0. So it's nothing. Save that. And I'm just going to check chat real quick. Looks like there are no questions. Okay, so let's see what we've got here. So down here we've selected, we know what component has been selected. So what we need to do is we need to get the details of that component. We need to get its properties. Right, so let's start by getting a reference to the component that we've selected. Make a new function here to find that a little bit easier. Kind of call that, we're going to return a hardware component and get component. Now I don't want to call it component because it's a little confusing with Unity. I'm using the same terminology. We're going to do a get hardware component by identifier. And yes, I tend to use long descriptive names. String identifier. Okay. And what that's going to do is, assuming that my database is solid, it is going to loop through here. Count is equal to this dot database dot what am I got? Components. No, stupid. Components dot count. I is less than this dot database, or no, sorry, less than count. Okay. So now we can iterate through those. And wow, what did I do? There we go. Okay, so if this dot database dot components I dot identifier is equal to identifier. Now I could try and worry about case insensitivity here, but since it's internally handled, I am not going to think it's an issue. So if it's equal, then we're going to return this database components I. And what's it complaining about here? Braces, oh yeah, whatever. That's just stall cop. I actually prefer to have this surrounded anyways, so let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so if we don't get anything, we're going to return. Can I return a null there? And that might not be applicable. We'll find out. Okay, so we've got that. We've got a way of getting that. So now we've got hardware component. Let's call it selected component is equal to get this dot get hardware component by identifier. So this should give us the selected thing, and then just let's verify this string dot format selected. Let's just do this. Yeah, selected 0, 1, and then we'll do selected component dot name, selected component dot description. Right. So let's see if that works. Wait for Unity to compile. Okay. So if we open up this here, clear. So if I select the AJ10, right, selected AJ1037, early liquid fuel. Okay, so we know that that's working. We've now got our component here. Let's check chat real quick. Okay. Not very many people interested, but hey, at least we can have the video for posterity's sake. So let's see what we got here. So we've got our component now. We don't really need these anymore. We know this is working. Okay, so what we need to do is we need to populate the properties block with the information from this component. Now, thinking. Let's see here. All right, bear with me a minute. I just want to look at something. So our properties block, we have the grid view, but these are structured differently. So right now, the grid view is kind of hard-coded in how it sets the details of the cell. So you can see here it's expecting to set a caption, an image if it's not in list mode, and it sets the name of the object based on its identifier. But I need to do something different for the property block. So the question is, what's the best way of doing that? I can subclass grid view to make, which is what I think I was going to do initially. I think that was my original plan. So I can subclass it and override set cell details to work for a property setup, which I think is what I'm gonna do. Yeah, so I'm gonna go over here. I'm gonna go to my UI components, create a new script. This is going to be property, oh, hey, right there, property grid view. And let's see here. Unity always makes a template that drives me crazy, so let's just fix this. Okay, so this is going to be from grid view, which is probably going to give me a using issue, or not. Grid view. Oh, I didn't namespace that. That's bad. Okay, whatever. We'll worry about that later. So we don't want any of this. What we do want though is public override. Void. What's it called? Set cell details, and that takes in a game object and an index. Fine. So we're saying essentially we're going to repeat this, but in a slightly different manner. It's not the cleanest code, but it'll work for now. Okay, so we're going to get the cell, and we want its. Right, I'm missing using Unity engine.ui. Okay. Right. So first off, I need to know what I'm looking at. So we've got a value and a key. Right, so problem is though the grid cell, I don't like that. Grid cell is also really kind of set up for a specific thing. It's got a caption and a name. I could repurpose this, but that's a little ugly too. So what's the best way of doing this? Sorry guys, bear with me a minute. I just need to spend a moment thinking of how I want to do this. Ideally, this thing should be more flexible. But I could make grid cell use I could make grid cell itself use a dynamic property layout which would cover caption and name, and then I wouldn't even need the subclass. It's not a bad idea actually. Now right now though, the properties, where are the properties handled? Hardware. Where's my hardware? properties are here, component properties. I could repurpose this. I want to probably do something a bit more generic, but let's do this real quick. So excuse me. Okay, so I didn't want to put all that in there. Whatever. We don't need most of this because this doesn't need to be that robust for the grid cell. But we are going to have a name, a property. We're going to have units. We're just going to have the value, in this case, be a string. And then we can get rid of all this probably. Don't need any of this. This just handles all this stuff here. Allows properties to be multiple types, but I don't need that for this. Strings will be fine. So a grid cell has a key and value. And then what we need to do is down here, where we were using that information, we're just going to, what's the best way of handling this? I could probably define something that maps, no, I know what I'll do. Right. Yeah, so what I'll do is iterate through the components, and based on the component type, the name of the component, I can get a property that matches. That might be a way of doing it. Think about that for a second. So this will have property, and then it'll have children. So something like UICell dot is there a I need to transform child. Yeah, get child count. Right, so I could do something like I equals 0, count is equal to, get child count, I is less than count, I plus, and then is it a game object dot? Yeah, game object go equals UICell dot transform dot get child I. Right, so that'll give us a bunch of errors apparently. Oh, so it returns transform, so game object. Right, so that'll give us the children game object. So in that case, that's going to iterate through, border and caption, for example. Then we want to, we're probably going to have to deal with two things, which is a text component and an image component. For the moment, I'm only going to do text components because I'm not dealing with the icons, but I can go back and change that later easily enough. So let's do, just thinking here. Right, so text component is equal to go.get component text if text component not equal to null, so we know it has it. Let's get the name. So go.name, this will be the name of the property we want. Right, so it's a grid cell. These have an array of thingamajiggers. Right, let me think here. What am I doing? Yeah, because there's multiple, right. So what I need actually to do is something else. I need to do something like this. Public class grid, or let's just do cell property. Just make this serializable for now. Worry about that later. Okay, we need these, right? And then this is going to be public list of cell properties. What the hell did I just do? Properties. And I could add convenience methods there, but at the moment I'm not going to worry about that. So let's go back down here. Right, so here, mapping would be more convenient, and I don't think I need to worry about serializing this. So I'm actually going to change this. I actually don't need. So I'm not actually don't need it. Okay, so I'm going to do this. I'm going to do public dictionary string properties. Really don't need this. I mean, I don't need to make this serializable anyways, to be honest. So then go down here and then if properties, oops, UI cell dot properties. No, I don't want UI cell. I want grid cell dot properties dot contains key go dot name. If it does, then we want to text component dot text is equal to cell dot properties get. No, sorry, I forgot. I've actually forgotten how dictionaries work. Right. Okay. So go down there. This is mostly irrelevant. However, do want to do something here. We'll assume it always has a property called name for the moment because I need to set it. So name. What's setting the name as the identifier, right? So actually we're going to change this and we're going to say cell.properties identifier. Yes, we shouldn't be assuming that's there. For the moment we will though. Okay, so that's that. In theory, then we're going to change this to be really? I don't know what StyleCop wants us to be private for. Whatever. Worry about that later. Okay, so we got cell, which contains the properties. So cell.properties dot nothing. Wait, oh. Properties dot add, and we're going to add an identifier, and that will be component dot identifier. So that's this guy, and then we're also going to do a cell dot properties dot add, and we're going to call that caption, and that's going to be component dot name, and this again, so now I've got an extra dot. Right, so that should refactor things and maintain what we had before. We're not going to need this anymore, actually, so we're going to get rid of this. Don't save that. Back to here. Property grid view can go away. Right, so in theory, we've refactored the way the grid cells are handled, and we should have the exact same functionality we had before, but we should now have a more flexible grid cell. Probably won't work the first time. Let's give it a shot. Huh, look at that, it did. Okay, so this works exactly like it did before, but the difference here, yeah, that's working. The difference here is, ooh, interesting. That might be, no, okay. So the difference here, though, is now that this is dynamically. It's not hard-coded to put a caption into the caption object. It's actually looking for properties based on the names of those things. So that means our dynamic properties, which have a value and a key, can also fill in using the exact same code. So we're going to go back to our component browser, which is right here. We have our selected component, right? So what we need to do is now go through that component properties and add them to the second grid view, which is here, right here, on the properties block. So let's get that. Well, actually, we can say okay, let's get the properties first. So we are running on Selector Engine, so we're going to do something like this here. Let's just do, we'll get the grid view, we'll get the properties, grid view, properties, grid view. In this case, though, we want panel and properties, right? So panel, properties block, properties block. Right, so that's going to give us this grid view here, this guy here, which is what's down here, and we also need to do we're going to get the text off of, so we need a name and description, right? So we're going to do something like this. We're going to do text. Component name is equal to panel properties name, right? Yep, name, and get the text component of that. And then we're going to do the same thing for the description. Components, only in this case we want description, right? So why is it complaining about text? I don't have Unity Engine UI. That's why. UI. Okay. So we can do, right, so now we can go and we get all the stuff we need. We can do component name.text is equal to, we have our hardware components for our selected component dot name, and we can do the same thing for the description, component description name description, right? Okay, and then lastly we have to go through components. So this isn't going to run all that often, so I'm going to be lazy at the moment. I might refactor this later, but for now I'll do this. Component property in selected component dot properties. Now this here, just for those who aren't aware, using a for each like here is somewhat bad because it's going to do some allocations. But this isn't a piece of code that's going to run that often. It's only going to run when you click on a component and then once. So I'm not too worried about it. I can go back and clean that up later. When you see me do things like this, that's a better way. It's a way of doing it without allocations. And you know, by getting the count ahead of time, you also only have to do the count once versus each iteration. So that's a much better way of doing it for code that's going to run more often. But for here, I'm just going to worry about this. I'm going to do, let me think, what am I doing here? So I got properties grid view, right? So I'm going to add, what am I going to do? What am I doing here? So I'm going to add an element to, right, so I'm going to do a grid cell equals new grid cell. So I'm adding cells to the grid view, and so that cell I'm going to do cell.properties.add, and I'm going to add, and I'm going to add an identifier because, do I need it? Yes, because it's going to, right, this is just, it doesn't really matter, this is just internal use for the game object name, but I'm going, and it's not selectable, so it's not a huge deal, but I'm going to add one anyways. So I'm going to add an identifier, and we're just going to call this, we're going to use the property name probably, so property.key, that works, it doesn't really matter. So, okay, I can give that to an empty string if I wanted to. But yeah, so we got that, and then we're going to, wait a minute, I don't want to do that for, yes I do. So then we're going to add the key. So that key is basically, in this case, is the name key here. So key property dot, well, it's also dot key. And then we also want to fill in the value, right? So we're going to do value here. The difference here, though, is value object, we're going to set it to property.value. Actually, this is a string format here. So we're going to do string format. This is going to be the value, space, and then the units. So we want property dot get value, string value, doesn't matter because we want a string, and then property dot property dot units, right? Yeah, so that in theory is that. Let's see what that does. Right, for Unity compile, which is annoying. Okay, let's see what abomination we've made here. Okay, so nothing down here. We click the AJ1037. We get its name and description. We don't, however, get any properties. So let's see what's going on here. It didn't. So all these cells here. So what it does is, if you'll notice, these are here as well. What it's doing, the grid view does, it pre-allocates a bunch of game objects to fill in like a whole page, and then just reuses those over as needed to display. So in these cases, was 2 of them. It just filled in. It basically reused those 2 for the visible items. It's just a little bit quicker that way. But in this case, it created all the cells and didn't actually create any properties, or any cells. So first thing I'm going to do is look for any errors. I don't see any. I do see 2 cells is the, so this here, 2 cells displays. That's talking about this guy. This says there are 0 cells displayed per page, and I'm going to look at the properties block, and this is the problem right here. Cells 0, so I didn't actually set, this is what I'm missing right here. So I didn't actually set, right, so I want to do my properties grid view dot cells dot add, and then add the cell. So what I did is I created the cell and populated the cell. I didn't actually add the cell to the grid view. Let's give that a try. Okay, AJ1037, and boom, there we go. Properties dynamically filled in. Mass, diameter, reliability, thrust. This is obviously a problem. it looks weird. It's mainly because this is too long. If we look again, do I still have it open? Yeah. We see that the value is nitric acid. What's happening here is this field's not big enough to hold the whole thing, but that's minor. We'll deal with that here. UDMH, oxide, so that all works. Select a new one, and there's a bug. So we're not clearing the cells out. We need to fix that. So as you can see here, what happened is we basically added more properties from the new one rather than, yeah. So let's fix that. I also want to double check something here. If I load the X405, description on them should be slightly different. Oh, it's being cut off as well. That's what's happening. So the description here, let's just make this guy bigger. He can be as big as he wants. There we go. Yeah, okay, so that's changing properly as we want. So the only thing we have left to fix is just we need to clear those properties out before we add more. And that's easy enough to do, but let me just check chat real quick. Okay, no question. So let's go back to a component browser. So when we have a new component selected, the first thing we want to do essentially is just clear that out. So let's do it here. Properties gridview.cells.clear. And honestly, that should be it. So select Unity. Play. Select your engine. There's our stats. Select our other engine, and right. So our stats aren't changing, which is obviously not correct. So first question is, so our name and description are changing, but this is not changing. So before we panic, the first thing to double check is maybe the definition is just the same on both. I might have just cloned one to the other. So let me double check that first. So 1.14 diameter, 84 kilogram mass. If I look at this, 84, 1.14, and if I look at this one, they are different. Okay, so the X405 has really, these numbers seem wrong to me, first of all. Okay, so these numbers are different, so I'm not going to worry about it. Or the numbers are different, so I know there's a bug. The numbers look wrong, but that's a rabbit hole. That's a data issue. I'm not going to worry about it. I'm supposed to be staying away from rabbit holes. So we have a bug. These have different properties. So the question is, why are the properties not correct? So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the loaded data. Maybe there's a bug with the loaded data. So before I deal with the whole UI issue, let's make sure it looks correct here. The hardware database, so you can see our stuff here. So here's our AJ10, here's our 405. If I go into properties and open a couple of these, so the AJ1037 has a mass of 84 kilograms and a diameter of 1.14. Properties of the X405 has a mass of 191, and okay, so the loaded data is correct. That's good. We know that means the problem is in the UI somewhere. So let's look at these here. So we click this, we select it, we see we've now created some cells for each of these, and they're being set accordingly. If I now select this one, these don't look to be changing, but since they're the same properties, they might be changing and we just don't realize it. There's a couple of ways I could double check that. I could add the identifier of the thing being displayed to see if it's changing. What's most likely happening here, though, is we're not updating the data being sent to the properties block, right? So we have an element here, we have these elements which don't, oh, because they're dictionaries and you can't see inside dictionaries, so, which is stupid. So yeah, so let's see if we can figure out what's going on. So the first thing I'm going to look for here is not there, it's in here. Component browser. I'm going to look to see that, make sure I'm sending the right So we double checked before that our selected component was correct. To verify this again, well, we know it is, right? Because the name and description is changing. So we know we're selecting and sending the data. Properties, grid, view, cells, component. I'm thinking, right, so we're setting these here based on the name and description of the selected component. So those do change. So we know we're setting the right component to the grid view. And we're doing selected component properties here. And we're adding, so we're clearing the cells up here, excuse me, and then adding them here. So the first thing I'm thinking is this is actually a problem with the grid view. I think it's not recreating the cells properly. One thing we can try doing is setting it being dirty to force it to redraw. That is what's happening. That is what's happening. And the reason being that the grid view caches itself and only updates if you page or if the number of cells that it has is changed, right? Oh, wrong key, right? So cells that count is not equal to the number of cells. So what we do is we cache the number of cells in the grid view, and if that hasn't changed, we assume the grid view hasn't changed and we don't need to redraw again, so we don't waste time redrawing. But in this case, we have the exact same number of properties being added, and thus it's not redrawing. So we can verify that easily. I'm positive that's the problem, but just to show, we can verify that by changing the name that gets added to the cells. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to set the identifier here to string format property underscore, and then I'm going to set this to also be the name of the object. So selected component.name, or actually let's do selected component.identifier. Right, so what I'm doing is just changing the name that is given to the cells game objects that are created in Unity. So when you create these, this name here essentially, it's really just for visual purposes, but almost positive what we're going to see here is that those are not changing to be reflective of the new thing. So we're going to select the AJ1037, and you see here, over here in the property, in the hierarchy rather, you can see that this cell belongs to the AJ1037. Now when we select the X405, this doesn't change. It doesn't change because the grid view didn't redraw itself. We verified that. I mean, I was pretty sure that was the case anyways, but that just let us verify it. So what we're going to do, and this is real simple, we're going to set all these properties, and then we're simply going to do properties gridview.isDirty is equal to true. This just tells it, hey, you've changed. You may not think you've changed, but we telling you you have changed. Redraw yourself, and that should fix it. So we'll compile. And play, and let's see what we got. So AJ1037, 84 kilogram bass, 1.14 meter diameter, X405, boom, and you'll see it changed over here as well, 405. So yeah, look at that. We've got the ability now to select and browse through our components. We only have 2 components at the moment, and I think the numbers are mixed. I think these numbers are actually reversed. The X405 was the first stage engine, so it should be the one with the larger diameter. Yeah, I think some of these values, not all of these values, just some of them have gotten reversed. But that's a rabbit hole. Don't matter. This works. Hey, look, the whole thing works. Okay. The page up, page down doesn't do anything because we have no pages. This button here is eventually going to be a button to allow you to do some filtering based on properties, but that's further down the road. Not worry about that. But yeah, so the purpose of this video was to do this UI, to hook everything up, fix all the bugs and whatnot, and we now have a working component browser with dynamic properties. Hope you enjoyed this. I hope this first dev stream wasn't a hot mess. If it turned out pretty good, I'll do more of these in the future, as well as pre-recorded ones and dev logs and whatnot. But other than that, thanks everybody for watching, and I'll see you again later.